I am Victor, 34 years old. 3 years ago, I drained my entire life savings, liquidated my investment portfolios, and completely wiped out the money I had been quietly setting aside as a future college fund for kids I didn't even have yet, all to rescue my parents from a devastating foreclosure. I gave them every single dollar of my hard-earned salary to keep a roof over their heads. And exactly how did they repay that ultimate sacrifice? On the sweltering night of their lavish 40th anniversary party, a party funded entirely by my invisible labor and financial subsidies, my own mother handed me a cheap, flimsy yellow plastic plate filled with cold, leftover chicken. While 24 esteemed guests dined on fine china under a rented crystal chandelier, she looked me dead in the eyes, pointed toward the dark, unair-conditioned back porch where the catering staff was sweating through their breaks, and whispered, "Just grab a plate with the staff, sweetie. Julian's investors need the visual aesthetic in the dining room. We don't have an extra seat for you. You know your place, son." She smiled that perfect, practiced society smile, expecting me to nod, walk out into the oppressive Arizona heat, and eat garbage in the shadows while my golden boy brother and his fake venture capitalist friends laughed over vintage wine I paid for. They humiliated me in front of everyone, actively erasing my existence to protect their wealthy, immaculate facade. But there was one major detail they completely failed to realize. They didn't know that the thick manila envelope resting quietly inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket wasn't a sentimental anniversary card. It was a formal, legally binding notice of default. And by the time this night was over, my arrogant father would be sprinting barefoot down the hot asphalt, slamming his fists against my car window, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. Before I tell you exactly how I legally dismantled my toxic family and took back my dignity, hit that like button if you believe that true justice always leaves a paper trail. And please, don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's go back to the exact moment the illusion finally shattered. It was a suffocating July night in Scottsdale, Arizona. You know the kind of heat I am talking about. It is that oppressive, relentless desert heat that presses heavy against the double-pane windows of multi-million-dollar homes, just waiting for a microscopic crack in the seal to seep inside and ruin the climate control. Inside my parents' sprawling estate, however, the temperature was a perfect 68 degrees. The central air conditioning hummed a quiet, expensive tune. It was a tune I knew intimately, considering I was the one secretly paying the massive electric bill for that property every single month so my parents wouldn't default on their utilities. The house had been completely transformed. It looked like a full-page spread straight out of an upscale architectural magazine. Rented crystal glassware sparkled fiercely under the dining room chandelier, casting tiny, arrogant rainbows across the imported mahogany wood. Tall, elegant glass vases filled with pristine white orchids served as centerpieces on the massive table. My mother, Margaret, had spent weeks obsessing over these details, ensuring that every napkin fold and every piece of silverware projected an aura of generational wealth. 24 guests were seated in those gold-cushioned velvet chairs. Every local politician my father, Harrison, desperately wanted to impress was sitting there. The town mayor, a couple of regional developers, and every single one of my older brother Julian's fake venture capitalist friends had a prime seat. They were laughing loudly, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings as they sliced into roasted beef tenderloins served on heavy, gold-rimmed porcelain plates. And then there was me. I was standing completely still on the wrong side of the kitchen island. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that I had specifically purchased because Margaret had mandated a strict formal dress code for the evening. The fabric was heavy, and standing in the kitchen next to the catering ovens was making the collar of my shirt stick uncomfortably to my neck. I watched my mother glide through the kitchen. She moved with the frantic, performative energy of a woman whose entire identity was tied to what her country club friends thought of her. I watched her completely bypass the neat stacks of elegant porcelain plates meant for the second course. Instead, she bent down, reached into a lower cabinet, pushed past the good kitchenware, and pulled out a flimsy yellow plastic plate. It was the exact kind of cheap, disposable plate you buy in bulk at a discount store for a toddler's messy birthday party. the kind of plastic that bends if you look at it too hard. I stood paralyzed by a strange, icy clarity as I watched her scoop a pathetic portion of lukewarm, heavily salted potatoes and a dry, unappetizing chicken breast onto it. The cheap polymer literally bowed under the weight of the mediocre food. She turned around, stepped close to me, and pressed that bending plastic into my hands. Her fingers were cold. Her voice was low, and her eyes darted nervously toward the arched doorway of the dining room. She was terrified that one of Julian's VIP guests might look in our direction and realize that the host's other son was standing in the kitchen like a hired servant. "Just grab a plate with the staff, sweetie," Margaret whispered, her tone carrying that sickly sweet manipulation she always used when she was about to demand a sacrifice. "Julian's investors need the visual aesthetic in there. We don't have an extra seat, and you are so good at keeping the catering staff organized. Take this out to the back porch. It's quiet out there. You know your place, son." I looked down at the yellow plate in my hands. A thin layer of translucent grease was already starting to congeal near the edge of the cold potatoes. The stark contrast was physically jarring. I looked through the wide architectural archway into the dining room. I could see my brother, Julian. He was 32 years old, leaning back in his plush velvet chair, swirling a glass of expensive Napa Valley Cabernet. He was laughing at a joke someone made, his teeth gleaming, projecting the arrogance of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire world. I was the only family member standing in the shadows. I was holding a plate that belonged in a garbage can. I was being ordered to go sit in the 95-degree humidity to eat leftovers so I wouldn't ruin their visual aesthetic. For a fraction of a second, she expected me to argue. She expected the usual, predictable dynamic. She waited for me to swallow the massive indignity, bow my head, and act as the family shock absorber, just like I always did. She expected me to prioritize her social standing over my own basic human dignity. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw the plate against the pristine stainless steel refrigerator. I didn't cause a scene that would give her the satisfaction of calling me unstable. Instead, my heart rate actually dropped. The stoic, detached, and utterly ruthless precision of a senior commercial title examiner took complete control of my central nervous system. I placed the yellow plastic plate exactly in the dead center of the massive granite island. I moved it a fraction of an inch to the left, aligning the circular edge perfectly with the geometric lines of the stone grout. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I had originally brought that envelope tonight as a gift. It was supposed to be a final, magnanimous gesture of grace. It contained a legal release that would have wiped clean the ledger that had been bleeding my finances dry for years. I had planned to hand it to my father during dessert, releasing them from the massive debt they owed me, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would finally buy me a permanent seat at their table. Instead, I opened the top kitchen junk drawer, bypassed the scattered takeout menus and spare batteries, and pulled out a thick red permanent marker. I uncapped it. The sharp, pungent smell of the ink hit my nose, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I pressed the broad felt tip against the heavy paper of the envelope. The ink bled slightly into the fibers as I wrote 2 words in massive, aggressive block letters across the front. Team player. I set the envelope right next to the cold chicken and the bending plastic. I capped the marker and tossed it onto the counter. It clattered loudly against the granite. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for my entire adult life was instantly gone. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger, sorrow, or negotiation. It was the voice of a creditor communicating a final decision. "I am going home," I said. Margaret blinked, startled by the sheer lack of emotion in my delivery. Her hand fluttered nervously up to her pearl necklace. "Victor, do not do this right now. You are overreacting. People will notice if you leave. We need you to coordinate the dessert service with the chef." I didn't offer a rebuttal. If you argue with a narcissist, you validate their twisted premise that the topic is open for debate. I simply turned my back on her. I engaged my physical momentum and walked away. I walked down the long, echoing hallway connecting the kitchen to the grand foyer. I passed the meticulously framed family photographs lining the walls. Pictures of Julian scoring a soccer goal in high school. Pictures of Harrison shaking hands with state senators. Pictures of Margaret posing at expensive charity galas. I was completely absent from every single frame. My entire existence in this house was purely structural. I was the hidden plumbing keeping the water running so they could host their parties. You don't display the plumbing in the dining room. You keep it hidden behind the drywall where it belongs. I reached the heavy mahogany front door. I grabbed the polished brass handle, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. I crossed the threshold and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy metal latch clicked into place. That sound was definitive. It instantly severed the fake laughter of the party, the clinking of the rented crystal, and the 15 years of invisible labor I had provided to keep that illusion alive. The Arizona night air hit me like a blast from an open oven, but for the first time in my entire life, I could actually fill my lungs with oxygen. I walked down the stamped concrete driveway. My dress shoes crunched softly against the loose gravel. I reached my car, unlocked the doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, but I didn't turn on the headlights immediately. I kept my foot on the brake and watched the front windows of the house through the sheer curtains. I waited. Took exactly 4 minutes. Through the illuminated glass, I saw a shift in the lighting. I saw the tall, imposing silhouette of my father, Harrison, walk into the kitchen. I saw him stop at the granite island. I watched him pick up the manila envelope. I saw the outline of his large hands tearing the paper open. I watched as he read the document inside. I saw his broad shoulders suddenly drop, as if a physical weight of 10,000 pounds had just crashed down onto his spine. The front doors of the estate flew violently open, slamming against the exterior stucco. Harrison burst onto the front porch. He had dropped his wine glass somewhere inside. He was sprinting full speed down the stamped concrete driveway, completely barefoot in his tailored dress pants. His face was twisted in absolute terror. "Victor!" he screamed. His booming, authoritative voice cracked, echoing desperately down the quiet, wealthy street. The neighbors, who were out on their porches enjoying the evening air, stopped and stared in shock. "Victor, stop the car!" he bellowed, reaching the edge of the driveway. He slammed his sweaty palms against the glass of my passenger side window, leaving greasy handprints on the pristine glass. His immaculate image, the patriarchal dominance he valued far more than his own son's life, dissolved right there on the hot asphalt in front of the exact people he had spent decades trying to impress. I looked him dead in the eyes through the glass. I didn't roll the window down. I shifted the transmission into drive, pressed my foot steadily onto the gas pedal, and pulled away from the curb. I watched him shrink in the rearview mirror until he was nothing more than a pathetic, barefoot shadow standing in the street. I didn't turn around. The countdown clock had officially started ticking. To truly understand why a few sheets of paper made a grown, image-obsessed man run barefoot into the street, screaming like a terrified child, you have to understand the specific toxic currency my family trades in. The envelope I left on that granite counter wasn't a grievance letter about my hurt feelings. It wasn't a passive-aggressive note complaining about a seating chart. It was a formal notice of default demanding payment in full on a secured promissory note. The outstanding balance? Exactly $420,000. That massive number didn't just materialize out of thin air. It was forged 3 years ago in the absolute crucible of my older brother's endless ambition and my father's desperate, pathetic need to keep up appearances. Harrison is a man who defines his entire existence by his zip code. He measures his self-worth by the height of his imported palm trees and the pristine condition of his driveway. To him, public failure is a fate far worse than death. He spent decades cultivating the image of a self-made patriarch, a captain of industry. Julian, my older brother, is the golden boy. He is a 32-year-old serial entrepreneur. That is the polite, socially acceptable term my mother uses when she is bragging at her country club luncheons. The realistic, legal term for Julian is a parasite in a tailored suit. Julian speaks entirely in podcast buzzwords. He talks endlessly about the grind, disrupting the market, and hustle culture. He drives a leased German sports car he absolutely cannot afford, and he walks into rooms expecting people to hand him money just for existing. 3 years ago, Julian pitched my parents a luxury real estate flipping business. He sat in their formal living room, projecting fake revenue charts onto the massive television screen, painting a beautiful, entirely fabricated picture of generational wealth. He told them he just needed the seed capital to get the operation off the ground. Harrison, blinded by his desperate desire to have a son who was a titan of industry, ignored every single rule of basic financial logic. He didn't consult a lawyer. He didn't ask for a business plan. He simply marched down to his local regional bank, leveraged the massive equity he had spent 30 years building, took out a $420,000 home equity line of credit against the Scottsdale estate, and handed the entire sum over to Julian. Julian burned through every single penny of that loan in 8 months. He bought a mid-century modern teardown in a trendy neighborhood. Instead of hiring licensed contractors, Julian hired the absolute cheapest day labor he could find to maximize his perceived profit margins. He didn't pull permits. The framing violated structural building codes. The new roof leaked massive amounts of water during the Arizona monsoon season. The city inspectors inevitably showed up and issued immediate stop work orders. Carrying costs bled the bank account dry. Julian completely abandoned the project, leaving behind a half-finished, rotting shell of a house and a towering mountain of unpaid vendor invoices. But the bank doesn't care about your podcast quotes. The bank doesn't care about your hustle culture. The bank only cares about its collateral. When Julian stopped making the loan payments, neon-colored notices of impending foreclosure started hitting Harrison's mailbox. My father tried to hide the letters from Margaret. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. The stress actively corroded his physical system. On a random Tuesday afternoon in November, I received a hysterical phone call from my mother while I was sitting at my desk reviewing a complex commercial title policy. I rushed to the local hospital emergency room expecting the absolute worst. I walked into the bright, sterile room and found Harrison hooked up to a heart monitor. The event was relatively mild. The doctor called it a stress-induced cardiac episode, but the reality of the situation hung heavy in the room. I stood near the foot of the hospital bed, listening to the steady, rhythmic beep of the machine. Julian was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the room, scrolling mindlessly on his phone. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't offer a single word of apology to the father who was currently lying in a hospital bed because of his reckless greed. He was entirely unbothered. And my mother, Margaret, was sitting in a vinyl chair, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, but she wasn't crying over her husband's arterial health. She wasn't worried that the man she loved might have died. She was crying because a collections agent from the bank had called her personal cell phone that morning, and she was absolutely terrified her friends at the country club would find out they were losing the estate. I stood there and looked at the three of them. I saw a man dying of his own pride. I saw a mother mourning her fragile social status. I saw a brother completely insulated from the devastating consequences of his own destruction. As a senior commercial title examiner, I evaluate financial risk for a living. I trace chains of custody. I find the lies hidden in the fine print. I know exactly how fast a bank will strip a family down to the studs, evict them, and auction off the remains of their life to the highest bidder. I could have let them fall. I should have let the system teach Julian a brutal, necessary lesson. But I was still operating under the delusion that I could save them. I chose grace. I left the hospital, drove straight to my office, and made the biggest financial mistake of my life. I liquidated my entire stock portfolio. I emptied the high-yield savings account I had spent a grueling decade building. Money that was supposed to fund my own future. Money that represented my salary, my late nights, my sacrifices. I didn't just hand Harrison a blank check. I am a professional. I treated the bailout like a corporate acquisition. I hired Clara, a ruthless real estate lawyer who strongly advised me against doing this. But I instructed her to execute a private purchase of the debt. I bought the paper directly from the original lender. I paid off the bank in full and took over the lien. I became the primary, secured lien holder on my parents' house. I drafted a formal promissory note. I allowed them to pay a minimum monthly balance with 0 interest, just to preserve their dignity and keep them off the streets. The house remained in their name on the public tax records, but the absolute legal authority of the floorboards beneath their feet belonged entirely to me. For the first month, there were tears. Harrison hugged me and called me his savior. Margaret sent me a massive bouquet of expensive orchids. By month 2, the amnesia set in. Human beings possess a terrifying capacity to normalize their own salvation. When you catch someone falling off a cliff, they thank you for saving their life. When you hold them suspended in midair for 3 years, they start complaining that your grip is wrinkling their shirt. The bailout quickly became a baseline expectation. Because I held the financial reins of the house, they naturally assumed I also wanted to hold the administrative burden of their entire lives. I became the silent, invisible engine running the family ecosystem. I built a complex spreadsheet on my personal laptop just to manage their chaos. Tab 1 tracked Harrison's property tax escrows, because he constantly forgot the deadlines. Tab 2 monitored Julian's HOA dues. Yes, Julian still lived in a luxury condo. If he missed a payment, the homeowners association could record a secondary lien on his property, which would eventually fall back on Harrison as his guarantor. I quietly paid those $550 monthly dues out of my own pocket just to keep the legal title clean. Tab 3 logged my parents' premium auto insurance and country club fees. Another $800 a month I subsidized so Margaret wouldn't face the crushing social humiliation of a declined card at the tennis pavilion. Every time I brought up the thousands of dollars I was bleeding to maintain their lifestyle, Margaret would wave her hand dismissively, sip her coffee and say, "Family helps family, Victor." I accepted this massive burden because I mistakenly believed my extreme competence would eventually earn their respect. I thought keeping the roof over their heads meant I had earned a permanent, respected seat at their table. I spent 3 years functioning as their invisible shield. The catalyst for my awakening didn't start with the plastic plate. The transition from loyal, self-sacrificing son to hostile creditor requires a specific series of indignities so sharp they slice right through the familial bond. That process began 3 hours before the anniversary party even started. I was driving north on Scottsdale Road in the blistering afternoon heat. The dashboard thermometer read a punishing 99 degrees. The envelope containing the loan forgiveness document, my ultimate gift of a clean slate, rested on my passenger seat. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was Margaret. I put it on speaker. "Victor, you need to turn around right now," she demanded. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I was driving safely. The panic in her voice was sharp and breathless. The catering company messed up the order. They forgot the dietary restrictions for Julian's special guests. We have 0 premium gluten-free options, and his investors are going to be here in 2 hours. You have to fix this. I kept my eyes on the road, easing my foot onto the brake as the traffic light turned yellow. "Did you call the caterer back to fix it?" "Of course I called them," she sighed heavily, projecting the tone of a woman deeply annoyed by my basic logic. "They can't fix it in time." Julian is beside himself. These are the men who are going to fund his new commercial project. If we serve them standard pasta, they will think we are amateurs. You have to go to that high-end farm-to-table restaurant near Camelback Mountain. Order 4 Chilean sea bass entrees and 2 vegan risotto dishes. Tell them to rush it. We cannot have those men eating out of plastic containers, so make sure they pack the food carefully. I glanced at my dashboard clock. Detouring to Camelback Mountain would add 45 minutes to my trip. "Mom, I can't pay for 6 premium entrees out of my own pocket right now. That is going to be almost $340. "Victor, please do not be difficult today." Margaret lowered her voice, adopting a tone of wounded martyrdom. "Julian needs this to be perfect. We are family. We step up when things go wrong. Just put it on your card, and we will settle it later. I have to go. The florist is here. We step up when things go wrong." That was the other password. The companion phrase to "you know your place." It was the rhetoric they used to weaponize my sense of duty. I checked my rearview mirror and pulled an illegal U-turn. I drove to the restaurant. I had to park 3 blocks away because the valet lot was full. I walked the distance in the unforgiving Arizona heat, feeling the heavy fabric of my suit press sweat against my spine. I stood at the host stand, sweating profusely, while the kitchen rushed the massive order. I handed the bartender my personal credit card and watched the charge process for $340. I carried 2 large, incredibly heavy paper bags back to my car. The thin handles dug deep into my palms. The smell of roasted garlic and seared fish instantly filled the cabin of my vehicle, clinging to the fabric of my clothes and ruining my expensive cologne. I was physically exhausted. I was financially depleted. But I was doing it for my family. I didn't know I was simply acting as a delivery driver, transporting the very food I would soon be forbidden to eat. I arrived at the Scottsdale estate just as the harsh desert sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The wide driveway was already lined with an intimidating fleet of luxury vehicles. I carried the heavy takeout bags through the side entrance, deliberately bypassing the stunning, vaulted foyer to avoid disrupting the arriving guests. The interior of the house was unrecognizable. Margaret had hired a professional event design team. The dining room looked like it belonged in a museum. Rented crystal glassware sparkled fiercely under the massive chandelier. The tall vases filled with imported orchids stood like sentinels on the table. 24 gold-cushioned chairs surrounded the polished mahogany. I dropped the heavy bags onto the kitchen island. Chef Ramon, the head of the catering staff, immediately started unpacking the containers. He offered me a sympathetic nod, clearly noting the exhaustion in my posture and the sweat dampening my collar. He efficiently transferred the expensive sea base I had just paid for onto elegant porcelain plates. I wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead. I took a deep breath, trying to regulate my heart rate, and walked into the dining room to find my assigned seat. I assumed I would be seated near the back, perhaps next to a distant cousin, but I at least expected a chair. I approached the massive table and began scanning the meticulously calligraphed place cards resting against the crystal wine glasses. The seating chart was a highly structured, rigid hierarchy. Harrison was seated at the head of the table, commanding the room. Margaret was seated at the opposite end. Julian occupied the absolute prime position, seated directly to my father's right. His wife, Vanessa, was seated beside him. Next to Vanessa sat Mr. Winston and 2 other men I didn't recognize. Men wearing expensive suits and aggressive expressions. These were the special private equity investors. I walked the perimeter of the table. I checked every single gold-rimmed card on the right side. I checked the left side. I checked the corners. My name was not there. I stopped walking. I recounted the cards. I verified the arithmetic. There were exactly 24 seats. Every single chair was assigned to a specific guest. I had just spent $340 securing the emergency premium meals for the men sitting next to my golden boy brother. I legally owned the $420,000 lien securing the very room they were sitting in. I paid the electricity bill that was currently powering the chandelier above their heads. And my name was completely absent from the table. I stood near the edge of the room, staring specifically at the place card belonging to Vanessa. She had not contributed a single dollar or a single ounce of effort to this night. Her only qualification for a velvet cushion was marrying the golden boy. Suddenly, I noticed an empty chair near the far end of the table. A local city councilman had temporarily stepped out to the back patio to take a phone call. My legs were aching with a dull, throbbing pain from standing and running errands in the intense heat for 3 hours. I desperately needed just 5 minutes to sit down, rest my spine, and catch my breath before the dinner service began. I approached the empty chair, reaching out my hand to pull the carved wooden frame back. Before my fingers could even graze the wood, a heavy, black, quilted lambskin designer bag landed squarely in the dead center of the velvet cushion. The thick gold chain strap clinked loudly against the seat. I stopped and looked up, Vanessa was standing on the other side of the chair. She was holding a half-empty glass of expensive Cabernet. She wore a smug, practiced smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Oh, sorry, Victor," Vanessa said. Her tone was light, airy, and entirely unapologetic. "I need a safe spot for my purse. The waiters are clearing plates, and I don't want anyone spilling coffee on the leather. It's vintage." She didn't ask if I wanted to sit. She didn't acknowledge the visible sweat on my forehead or the heavy fatigue in my posture. She simply claimed the space for her accessory. To Vanessa, a $3,000 designer handbag inherently possessed more value, more right to occupy space, than the brother-in-law who subsidized the roof over her head. I looked across the table. My father, Harrison, was standing less than 10 feet away. He was holding a freshly poured drink, chatting animatedly with Mr. Winston. Harrison had a clear, unobstructed view of the interaction. He saw me reach for the chair. He saw Vanessa physically block me with her purse. He made direct eye contact with me for a fraction of a second. Then, he deliberately turned his back, shifting his body weight to face the investor, letting out a loud, hearty laugh at a comment I couldn't hear. That passive betrayal stung far more sharply than a direct, verbal insult. It officially confirmed the household hierarchy. Protecting Vanessa's aesthetic comfort was a significantly higher priority than defending his own son's physical exhaustion. I was expected to yield to a handbag. I stepped back from the table. I retreated to the boundary line dividing the dining room from the kitchen. I stood in the shadows, leaning against the doorframe, becoming the invisible ghost I was always meant to be. A few minutes later, the guests took their seats. Harrison picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it firmly against the rim of his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut cleanly through the ambient noise. The room immediately fell silent. Harrison stood at the head of the mahogany table, buttoning his tailored jacket. He possessed a terrifying, sociopathic ability to project total financial security while standing on top of a collapsed checking account. 40 years ago, I made the best decision of my life, Harrison began. His voice was rich and resonant, projecting effortlessly down the length of the table. He raised his glass toward Margaret, praising her for building a beautiful family. The guests murmured in polite appreciation. Harrison paused, letting the sentiment settle before rapidly pivoting to the real, calculated agenda of his speech. "But tonight is not just about our past," Harrison continued, making a sweeping gesture toward the opposite end of the table. "Tonight is about the legacy we are building for the future. And Margaret and I could not be prouder of the man carrying that legacy forward. I want to raise a special glass to my son, Julian, and my wonderful daughter-in-law, Vanessa." Harrison placed a hand over his heart, his voice growing thicker with entirely manufactured emotion. "Putting together a night like this takes incredible generosity. Julian and Vanessa funded and organized every single detail you see around you tonight. They wanted to honor us, and they spared no expense. From the vintage wine to these beautiful floral centerpieces, they made this anniversary a true masterpiece." To Julian and Vanessa, the other 22 guests raised their glasses in unison. A massive chorus of applause and congratulations echoed through the dining room. I stood in the kitchen and watched my brother absorb the applause. Julian leaned back in his gold-cushioned chair. He offered a humble, self-deprecating nod to the investors sitting beside him. Vanessa beamed, flashing a bright white smile, acting as if she had spent months agonizing over napkin folds and menu pairings. I didn't interrupt the toast. I didn't storm into the dining room demanding recognition. I simply stood behind the granite counter and performed a silent, devastating forensic audit. Harrison claimed Julian funded the floral arrangements. I looked at the tall glass vases overflowing with white orchids. On June 14th, exactly 3 weeks prior, I had authorized a $1,200 wire transfer from my personal checking account to the floral designer because Margaret had called me crying that her debit card declined at the register. Harrison claimed Vanessa procured the vintage wine. I looked at the dark red liquid swirling in the crystal glasses. I paid $800 for those cases using my own industry discount and tracked the shipment to ensure it didn't spoil in the heat. Furthermore, because I monitored Julian's HOA warnings on his condo, I knew the exact state of his financial liquidity. I knew Julian currently had less than $400 in his primary checking account. His luxury flipping business was a defunct shell. He was surviving purely on credit card debt and the illusion of pending venture capital. Julian was sitting 40 feet away from me, getting a standing ovation for a tab that I paid. This was the pebble of stolen credit added to the massive boulder of disrespect. But the stolen credit was merely the appetizer. The main course of their betrayal was about to be served, and it was a dish that would trigger a federal crisis. The applause died down. The wine glasses were half empty. Julian unbuttoned the top button of his tailored suit jacket and stood up. He didn't tap his glass. He simply commanded the space using the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his adult life. He locked eyes with Mr. Winston and the two other investors. "I want to thank my father for his kind words," Julian began, his tone shifting instantly from humble son to visionary businessman. "We are here celebrating 40 years of history tonight. But history is only valuable if you use it as a foundation to build something bigger. That is why tonight, I am officially announcing the launch of our new commercial property venture." A polite murmur of intrigue rippled through the guests. Mr. Winston leaned in slightly, calculating profit margins in his head. "We are not starting small," Julian said, his voice rising in volume. "We have secured a prime parcel of land near the new industrial park. But to move fast in this market, you need liquid capital. You cannot wait around for traditional underwriting. You need leverage." I watched him from the shadows. As a professional who spends 50 hours a week evaluating commercial property transactions, I recognized the pitch immediately. He was reciting phrases he had memorized from a cheap real estate seminar. "And that brings me to the second part of this announcement," Julian said, flashing a brilliant smile toward Harrison. "A true patriarch knows when to pass the torch. To fund our first major commercial acquisition, my father has agreed to formally gift me this beautiful estate." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, but the gears in my analytical mind shifted into violent overdrive. Julian turned back to the investors. "We will execute the transfer next week. I will be pledging this property as collateral to secure a $1.2 million private equity commercial loan. Clean title, tremendous equity. We close the funding next Friday and break ground by the end of the month." The dining room erupted into thunderous applause. Harrison stood up and hugged Julian, patting him firmly on the back. Vanessa raised her wine glass, cheering loudly. I stood trapped in a surreal moment of suspended animation. The applause echoed off the vaulted ceilings, but all I could hear was the cold, precise arithmetic of federal statutes calculating in my brain. To the 24 people sitting in that room, Julian sounded like a bold entrepreneur making a strategic financial maneuver. To a senior commercial title examiner, he sounded like a man publicly confessing to premeditated bank fraud. Here is the absolute structural reality of the real estate market. You cannot pledge an asset you do not own. You cannot borrow 7 figures against a property that carries a primary lien without fully disclosing it. 3 years ago, I paid $420,000 to rescue this exact house. I hired an attorney. I recorded a primary lien against the property deed down at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office. My name is permanently listed on the public record as the secured creditor. Harrison cannot legally gift the house to Julian without my notarized signature releasing the lien. The title is not clean. It is heavily encumbered by my paper. If Julian approaches a private equity lender to secure a $1.2 million loan, he has to submit a fraudulent loan application, swearing under penalty of perjury that the property is owned free and clear. Signing a uniform commercial loan application with known false statements regarding collateral is a direct violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1344. It is a federal felony. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was not a spontaneous idea. A $1.2 million loan requires weeks of preliminary discussions. Harrison and Margaret knew about this plan. They had sat in their living room and conspired with Julian to leverage the house. They knew I held the paper. They knew I owned the equity. They simply didn't care. In their minds, my financial bailout was not a legally binding contract. It was just family money. They assumed they could bully me into signing a release deed after the fact, or worse, they planned to ignore me entirely, assuming I would never check the county records. If Julian secured that loan and his project failed, which his track record guaranteed, those predatory private equity lenders would seize the house within 90 days. My parents would be completely homeless. My $420,000 life savings would be entirely wiped out, absorbed by the senior creditors in the ensuing legal chaos. My family was actively conspiring to bankrupt me to fund an illusion. The manila envelope resting in my jacket pocket transformed in an instant. It was no longer a tool of forgiveness. It was a required legal shield against federal complicity. That was the exact moment Margaret walked into the kitchen, pulled out the yellow plastic plate, scooped the cold chicken onto it, and ordered me to hide on the patio. The physical banishment perfectly mirrored the legal erasure they were plotting. They wanted me hidden in the dark so Julian could project an illusion of ownership to his lenders. My physical absence from the dining room was required to maintain the lie, just as my legal absence from the property title was required to secure the funding. I placed the plate down. I wrote the words "team player" on the notice of default. I walked out the door. The social contract was permanently null and void. The drive down the freeway heading back to my apartment in Tempe was completely silent, save for the hum of my air conditioning and the rhythmic thumping of my own heartbeat. The dashboard clock read 9:14 p.m. The transition from loyal son to hostile creditor does not happen overnight. But when the catalyst finally sparks, the inferno burns with terrifying speed. Back at the Scottsdale estate, the dessert course was likely being served. The chocolate tarts were landing on the table. The coffee was being poured. The guests were unwinding, preparing their polite exit strategies. And Harrison was likely standing in the kitchen, staring at the notice of default, his patriarchal dominance evaporating the second his brain processed the words. Payment in full required in 30 days. I pulled into my apartment complex, parked my car, and walked up the stairs to my unit. The silence of my living room welcomed me. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour myself a drink to numb the pain. I dropped my keys on the console table and walked into the kitchen to pour a simple glass of cold water. My phone, resting on the quartz countertop, suddenly began to vibrate loudly. The screen illuminated the dark room. It didn't ring once. It vibrated in a continuous, relentless, desperate sequence. The device rattled against the hard surface, inching toward the edge. I picked it up and looked at the lock screen. It wasn't Harrison calling to apologize or beg for mercy. It was a voicemail from Margaret. I tapped the screen, set the phone down, and let her voice echo through my quiet kitchen. "Victor, answer your phone right now," Margaret demanded. The tone was incredibly sharp, completely devoid of any maternal warmth or concern. It was the exact voice of a retail manager reprimanding a negligent teenage employee. "Your father is furious about your little stunt last night, leaving the party like that. We will discuss your dramatic behavior later. Right now, we have a real problem. The smart TVs are down, and the security cameras are offline. The internet provider says the billing method was removed. I need you to log in and fix the router settings before Julian's investors email him the loan documents today. Call me immediately." I listened to the message twice to ensure I absorbed the sheer, staggering magnitude of their delusion. I had just placed a legal guillotine over their heads. I had started a 30-day countdown clock that would legally strip them of their primary asset, execute a foreclosure, and leave them homeless. And my mother was calling me to complain about the Wi-Fi. They were standing on the train tracks, watching a massive locomotive speed directly toward them, and they were annoyed that the wind from the engine was messing up their hair. Harrison had clearly convinced them that the legal document was a bluff, a theatrical prop I printed out to throw a tantrum over the seating chart. They still treated me like their unpaid IT secretary, expecting me to troubleshoot a router while I literally held the deed to their ruin. I didn't call her back. I deleted the voicemail. Letting people face the natural, devastating consequences of their own incompetence is a brutal, silent process. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my personal financial dashboard. The screen populated with pie charts and recurring payment schedules. It was time to systematically dismantle the invisible infrastructure I had built to protect them. I navigated to the portal for Harrison's premium auto insurance policy. He was a terrible driver who had rear-ended a delivery truck 2 years ago, causing his premiums to skyrocket. I linked my card to prevent his coverage from lapsing. I clicked the settings icon, selected the payment methods tab, and hit delete. The website threw a warning that the account would fall into immediate arrears. I confirmed the deletion. Next, I opened the billing page for the Desert Highlands Country Club. Margaret viewed her membership there as a vital organ. The monthly fee was $600. I clicked cancel. I moved down the list with the cold efficiency of a machine. I logged into the Regional Water and Power Authority. I removed my banking details from the automatic utility drafts for the Scottsdale property. I accessed the regional internet service provider and permanently terminated the billing agreement. Finally, I navigated to the HOA portal for the luxury condominium where Julian resided. I was listed as the secondary emergency contact and the backup payment source. I erased my name, my phone number, and my checking account routing digits. I opened a blank calculator app on my screen. I inputted the exact amounts I had just removed. Auto insurance, $210. Country club dues, $600. Utilities, $340. Julian's HOA dues, $550. The total calculated instantly, $1,700 a month. I halted a massive $20,400 annual subsidy with 5 clicks of a mouse. I closed the laptop and took a sip of my water. The ecosystem I had meticulously maintained was shutting down, sector by sector. The power grid was failing. The safety nets were completely gone. My parents were about to experience the abrasive, unforgiving friction of a world that expected them to pay their own way. The friction of my absence burned through the family over the next 72 hours. I received absolutely no text messages. I received no apologies. I received a profound, heavy silence. I knew exactly what that silence meant. It was the sound of my parents colliding with the unyielding reality of automated billing systems and customer service representatives who do not accept family loyalty as a form of payment. I spent Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday immersed in my duties as a senior commercial title examiner. I sat in my corner office, analyzing commercial zoning ordinances and drafting title commitments. My mind was razor-sharp. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for 3 years was completely eradicated. On Thursday afternoon, at exactly 2:14 p.m., the heavy glass doors to my office suite swung open with violent force. I heard the receptionist's voice register a polite note of alarm. "Sir, you cannot go back there without an appointment." Heavy, rapid footsteps pounded against the commercial carpet. The footsteps belonged to a man who firmly believed the rules of physical space did not apply to him. Julian appeared in the doorway of my office. He didn't knock. He leaned against the aluminum door frame, crossing his arms over the chest of a light blue designer dress shirt. He possessed the polished, aggressive posture of a man trying to bully an opponent through sheer visual volume. He looked angry, but the anger was superficial. Beneath the scowl, he projected pure, unadulterated annoyance. He viewed his presence in my office as an inconvenient errand he was forced to run. "What is this garbage, Victor?" Julian barked. He unfolded a piece of heavy paper from his back pocket and tossed it onto the center of my desk. I looked down. It was the notice of default. The thick red marker spelling out team player was still clearly visible on the manila envelope he had brought with him. I closed the digital PDF on my left monitor. I picked up my pen and set it perfectly parallel to my keyboard. I looked up at my brother. "That is a formal demand for the outstanding balance of a $420,000 loan," I replied. My voice was perfectly even. I did not match his aggressive volume. I kept my tone flat and professional, Exactly how I speak to hostile clients. You and Harrison breached the terms of the promissory note when you publicly announced your intent to leverage the collateral without my consent. You have 27 days left to cure the default. Julian laughed. It was a short, harsh sound completely devoid of humor. He shook his head and ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. You are crazy, he said, stepping further into the room. He placed both hands heavily on the edge of my desk, leaning forward to occupy my personal space and intimidate me. Dad said you were throwing a tantrum over the seating chart at the party. I told him you were just being dramatic. But pulling this legal stunt? You are actually trying to sabotage my business deal because Mom made you sit in the kitchen. I analyzed his statement. Harrison had indeed convinced Julian that the legal document was a bluff. They had diagnosed a fatal financial crisis as a petty emotional grievance. Their arrogance was so deeply ingrained that they could not fathom a member of their own family actually executing a calculated legal strike. I have investors waiting, Victor, Julian continued, his tone shifting from mockery to a demanding bark. The private equity guys ran a preliminary title search on the property this morning. They found your lien. They will not release the $1.2 million until the title is clean. He reached into his expensive leather messenger bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the smooth surface of my desk. It was a subordination agreement. It was a standard legal form. If I signed that paper and had it notarized, my primary lien would legally be pushed into a secondary, virtually worthless position. Julian knew the lenders would take the primary position. If Julian defaulted on his commercial loan, the lenders would foreclose, seize the house, and my $420,000 investment would be entirely wiped out in the liquidation process. Sign the paper, Victor, he ordered, aggressively tapping his index finger against the signature line. Let my guys take the primary position. We close the funding tomorrow afternoon. Do not make this harder than it has to be. We are family. I looked at the document. He was asking me to voluntarily forfeit my entire life savings, my future, so he could play real estate developer with a syndicate of predatory lenders. He expected me to absorb all the massive risk while he absorbed all the cash. I looked at Julian. His jaw was clenched. He firmly believed he held the dominant position. He assumed my silence was compliance. He assumed the gravitational pull of family pressure would eventually force my hand, just like it always did. I didn't argue. I didn't explain the absolute, staggering insanity of his request. If you argue with a narcissist, you validate their premise that the topic is open for debate. Instead, I executed a brilliant, flawless tactical maneuver. I threw up a smokescreen. I pushed the subordination agreement back across the desk toward him. I am not going to sign a blank check, Julian, I said in a soft, non-committal voice. I am a title examiner. I do not subordinate my position without reviewing the primary debt instruments. Julian frowned. His aggressive confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. What does that mean? It means I need to see the paperwork, I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic chair, projecting total ease. If you want me to risk $420,000, I need to see the exact terms of your business deal. Send me your loan application. Send me the underwriting documents you submitted to your investors. Let me review the bank paperwork. If the numbers make sense, we can talk about subordination. Julian stared at me. The extreme annoyance on his face slowly morphed into a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He thought he had won. He interpreted my request for paperwork as a face-saving measure. He assumed I was looking for a technical excuse to cave to his demands while maintaining a fake facade of professional diligence. He believed he had successfully bullied his younger brother into submission. Fine, Julian said, snatching the subordination agreement off the desk and shoving it back into his bag. I will email you the full application packet by 4 p.m. today. Review it tonight. We notarize the subordination first thing tomorrow morning. Do not drag your feet on this, Victor. He turned and walked out of my office. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say thank you. He simply vanished, leaving the faint, lingering scent of his expensive cologne in the air. I watched his silhouette disappear down the hallway. Julian was a man who lived his entire life skipping the required reading. He assumed business was conducted through firm handshakes, podcast quotes, and aggressive posturing. He lacked the fundamental attention to detail required to understand the mechanism of his own destruction. I didn't ask for his loan application to verify his profit margins. I didn't ask for it because I had any intention whatsoever of signing the subordination agreement. I asked for it because a uniform commercial loan application requires the borrower to list all known debts, liens, and liabilities associated with the collateral property. It requires the borrower to sign their name at the bottom of the page, swearing under penalty of perjury. If Julian had submitted that application to his private equity lenders without disclosing my primary lien, he had committed a federal crime. If he emailed that signed application directly to me, he wasn't just committing a crime. He was handing the physical, undeniable evidence of that crime directly to his primary creditor. He thought he was providing me with the reading material necessary to secure my compliance. In reality, he was handing me the exact documentation I needed to prove malicious intent. The notice of default was originally based on a verbal threat made during a dinner party. A signed, fraudulent loan application would transform that verbal threat into an ironclad federal breach of contract. It would make the foreclosure absolute, legally bulletproof, and completely unassailable in any court of law. I turned my attention back to my left monitor. I opened my email client. I sat back and watched the blank inbox, waiting for the golden boy to hand his brother the exact weapon needed to legally destroy him. I sat at my desk, the dual monitors casting a pale, clinical light across the polished mahogany surface of my workspace. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 3:15 p.m. I was waiting for the 4 p.m. deadline I had given Julian. I was waiting for the notification chime of an incoming email that would deliver the fraudulent uniform commercial loan application. I was anticipating the arrival of undeniable federal evidence. Instead, my personal cell phone, resting entirely ignored on the far corner of my desk, suddenly sprang to life. It did not ring. It vibrated in a continuous, relentless, and aggressive sequence that made the device actually rattle against the hardwood, inching dangerously close to the edge. I reached over, picked it up, and looked at the illuminated lock screen. A massive cascade of text messages was flowing down the display in real time. They were not from Julian. They were not from Margaret. They were from the extended, tangled branches of the family tree. People I had not spoken to in months, some in years. The first message was from my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister, a woman who thrived on suburban drama. I cannot believe what I am reading on the internet right now. How could you do this to your own mother? After everything they have done to raise you. The second message was from my cousin Felix, a guy who had notoriously borrowed $2,000 from my salary 3 years ago and conveniently developed amnesia regarding the repayment. We all knew you were always a little stiff, Victor, but trying to make your parents homeless over a petty misunderstanding is a completely new low. You need to get serious psychiatric help. The third was from my Uncle Arthur. Call your father immediately and apologize before you completely destroy this family forever. You are a disgrace. I unlocked the phone and opened the massive family group chat. The thread contained over 40 members, including distant relatives who only ever surfaced during major holidays or when there was fresh gossip to consume. The chat was completely flooded with varying degrees of manufactured outrage, performative shock, and unsolicited, highly aggressive advice regarding my mental health. I scrolled past the bombardment of accusations to locate the primary source of the ignition. Cousin Felix had shared a direct link to a public Facebook post written by my sister-in-law, Vanessa. I tapped the link. The application opened to reveal a remarkably lengthy, meticulously crafted status update authored by the woman who had claimed my seat for her vintage handbag. It was accompanied by a carefully curated, highly filtered photograph of Harrison and Margaret dancing at their anniversary dinner, looking happy, vibrant, and blissfully unaware of the financial ruin hanging over their heads. The text of the post was an absolute masterclass in performative victimhood. With a heavy heart, I am asking for prayers for our family today. Vanessa wrote, her digital words dripping with weaponized, trendy therapy language. We recently celebrated my wonderful in-laws' 40th anniversary, honoring two incredible people who have sacrificed absolutely everything to give their children a beautiful life. Unfortunately, what should have been a magical night was completely ruined by a devastating and erratic display from Julian's brother, Victor. I kept reading, dissecting the narrative strategy she was deploying with the cold detachment of an auditor. Victor has been struggling with deep-seated jealousy and severe mental instability for quite some time, Vanessa claimed, actively spinning a web of fake, condescending concern. Instead of celebrating his parents, he caused a horrific, aggressive scene and abandoned the party. Now, driven by spite, he is attempting to exploit a baseless, technical legal loophole to steal their estate and throw them onto the street. Julian and I are working tirelessly, consulting with our own lawyer, and doing absolutely everything in our power to protect Harrison and Margaret from this cruel, targeted extortion. Please send them love and light during this incredibly dark chapter. I set the phone down on my desk and leaned back in my chair. In psychology, this specific sequence of toxic behavior is known by a very distinct acronym, DARVO. Deny the behavior, attack the individual confronting the behavior, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. Margaret and Vanessa had quickly realized that my administrative compliance was completely gone. They knew I had cut off their auto insurance, their country club dues, their internet access, and Julian's HOA fees. They understood that Julian's aggressive bullying tactics in the lobby of my office had completely failed to produce a signed subordination agreement. Because they entirely lacked any actual financial leverage or legal standing, they deployed their only remaining asset, their social capital. Vanessa operated in a superficial world where reality was strictly dictated by the consensus of an online audience. Her entire currency was local influence. Margaret used her social standing to maintain her pristine facade at the country club. They firmly believed that public humiliation was the ultimate, unbeatable weapon. Because Harrison and Margaret were absolutely terrified of public shame, they projected their own greatest fear directly onto me. They assumed a highly coordinated public character assassination would break my spirit. They thought it would shame me into dropping the foreclosure, forcing me to transfer the deed to Julian just to make the public nightmare stop. They fully expected me to retreat into the shadows, draft a frantic, highly emotional defense on Facebook, and beg my aunts and uncles to believe my side of the story. But when you argue with a lie, you give the lie dignity. I do not give lies dignity. I give them receipts. I turned away from my buzzing phone and faced my computer monitors. I logged into my personal, highly encrypted secure server. As a title examiner, my entire professional survival depends on immutable, undeniable records. I document every transaction, every interaction, and every timeline. I opened the digital folder labeled Scottsdale Residence Bailout. First, I located the official bank confirmation of the massive wire transfer I had authorized 3 years ago, the money that had completely wiped out my future college fund and my hard-earned savings. The document displayed the exact date, the routing numbers, and the precise sum, $420,000. It clearly showed the funds moving directly from my personal accounts to the original mortgage lender, legally paying off the massive debt my father had incurred to fund Julian's first failed business. I took a precise, high-resolution digital screenshot of the transfer record. Next, I opened the PDF file containing the official promissory note. The legal document explicitly, unequivocally outlined the terms of my financial bailout. It legally named me as the primary secured lien holder of the estate. At the absolute bottom of the page, in stark, undeniable black ink, rested Harrison's notarized signature, legally acknowledging the massive debt. I took a second digital screenshot, ensuring the notary stamp was perfectly legible. Finally, I reached for my cell phone and opened my personal photo gallery. On the night of the anniversary dinner, right before I walked out the heavy mahogany front door, I had taken a single wide-angle photograph of the dining room. I had taken it purely to document the physical state of the space, anticipating that my family might try to claim I caused physical property damage during my exit to bolster a fake lawsuit against me. The photograph beautifully captured the opulent setting. It showed the rented crystal, the imported orchids, the massive mahogany table, and the glowing chandelier. And sitting directly on the velvet cushion of the only empty chair in the entire room, right on the edge of the frame, was Vanessa's $3,000 black quilted lambskin designer bag. I saved the photograph to my main album. I opened the extended family group chat on my phone. The notification bubble showed 42 new unread messages. Aunt Beatrice was currently typing another massive paragraph about the importance of respecting your elders and protecting your inheritance. I did not type a greeting. I did not offer any emotional context. I did not apologize for the interruption. I selected the first screenshot and uploaded the official bank wire transfer. The image loaded into the chat thread, a digital, undeniable mathematical record of a $420,000 bailout funded entirely by my salary. I selected the second screenshot and uploaded the signed, notarized promissory note. The image displayed Harrison's legally binding confession of the massive debt. I selected the third image and uploaded the photograph of the dining room. The incredibly expensive black designer bag resting on the only available chair visually confirmed my exact, humiliating priority level within that household. I watched the three images stack neatly, one after another, in the conversation thread. The incoming messages from my relatives stopped abruptly. Aunt Beatrice's typing bubble instantly disappeared. I tapped the text box at the bottom of the screen. I did not write a long, emotional paragraph defending my mental health. I did not engage with Vanessa's weaponized diagnostic buzzwords. I simply wrote a single, devastating sentence. The bank does not accept jealousy as a mortgage payment. 21 days left. I hit send. The message appeared directly beneath the three empirical, irrefutable pieces of evidence. I set the phone face up on the desk and watched the screen. A minute passed. 2 minutes passed. 5 minutes passed. The massive group chat remained in complete, absolute, deafening silence. It was the collective sound of 40 relatives simultaneously processing the total, catastrophic collapse of the Golden Boys narrative. They were reading the wire transfer. They were recognizing Harrison's legal signature. They were staring at the designer bag sitting comfortably on the chair while the man who literally bought the house was painted as a deranged villain. The smear campaign disintegrated entirely under the sheer, crushing weight of empirical data. Vanessa's tactic relied on the assumption that family matters are always handled through emotional manipulation and whispered gossip. She brought a social media post to a forensic audit. The public attack was officially over. At exactly 4:12 p.m., an email notification chimed loudly from the speakers of my workstation. The sender address belonged to Julian. The subject line read, "Confidential commercial loan documents, subordination required ASAP." I clicked on the email. The message contained absolutely zero text in the body. Julian did not offer a greeting. He simply attached 3 encrypted PDF files and fully expected me to sign away my legal leverage. He had walked blindly, arrogantly right into the trap. I downloaded the files to my secure server. The first document was a standard uniform commercial loan application. The second was a comprehensive statement of assets and liabilities. The third was the preliminary underwriting approval from Mr. Winston's private equity lending syndicate. I opened the loan application. I engaged the analytical protocol that defines my career in real estate. I bypassed the summary pages and scrolled directly to Section 4, Real Estate Owned, and Section 5, Declarations Regarding Collateral. I read the text line by line. In Section 4, Julian had listed the Scottsdale house as the primary collateral for the $1.2 million commercial funding. In the column explicitly designated for existing mortgages, liens, or encumbrances, he had typed a single, undeniable digit, 0. In Section 5, the application asked a direct, legally binding question. Is the property subject to any unrecorded claims, pending litigation, or private liens? Julian had confidently checked the box marked no. I scrolled to the final page of the document. At the bottom of the form, directly beneath a bold, capitalized warning regarding the severe federal penalties for wire fraud and making false statements to a financial institution, rested 2 signatures. The first signature belonged to Julian. The second signature belonged to my father, Harrison, acting as the guarantor and the party transferring the asset. They had actually signed the paperwork. They had sworn under penalty of perjury that the house was free and clear of any encumbrances. Julian's staggering arrogance had completely blinded him to the structural reality of the legal system. Harrison's massive ego had allowed him to blindly endorse his son's lies without reading the fine print. When Julian marched into my office and threw the subordination agreement on my desk, he assumed I was looking for an excuse to cave. He thought he was demonstrating his aggressive business acumen. In reality, he had just emailed the primary creditor documented, irrefutable proof of a federal felony. The notice of default was originally triggered by his public, verbal announcement at the anniversary dinner. But verbal statements can be debated in a lawsuit. They can be downplayed as bravado or drunken exaggeration. A signed uniform commercial loan application transmitted across state lines via email cannot be debated. It is an immutable physical fact. It completely transformed a messy family dispute into an ironclad, unassailable federal breach of contract. I opened a new email draft. I attached the fraudulent loan application Julian had just sent me. I attached the signed promissory note proving my legal claim. And I attached the recorded deed of trust bearing the Maricopa County official stamps. I addressed the email directly to the Chief Compliance Officer of Mr. Winston's lending syndicate. I typed a concise, brutally professional message. Please find attached the recorded primary lien on the Scottsdale property listed in the associated application. The borrower has failed to disclose this superior encumbrance. Please be advised, this asset is currently under a formal notice of default and is actively proceeding toward foreclosure. Any secondary capital deployed against this collateral is done entirely at your own risk. I clicked send. With a single click of my mouse, I effectively detonated Julian's $1.2 million commercial project. The syndicate would review the attachments, run a secondary audit, and immediately pull their funding commitment. Julian's investors would abandon him the second they realized he attempted to pledge encumbered collateral. His grand venture was completely dead in the water. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Clara, my real estate attorney. The call connected on the second ring. "Clara, we have the signed application," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "They attempted to secure the funding without disclosing my position. The breach is fully documented." "Understood," Clara replied, her tone matching my professional cadence. "We are starting the legal machinery now. I will issue the formal 30-day countdown to the county. Proceed with the formal execution," I instructed. "Offer absolutely no extensions. The psychological architecture of human panic relies on a very specific, predictable sequence of revelations. The first stage is aggressive denial. The second stage is explosive anger. The third stage is the frantic, uncoordinated scramble for a viable exit strategy." With exactly 15 days left on the 30-day countdown clock, Harrison finally reached the third stage. The denial evaporated the exact moment Mr. Winston's lending syndicate officially withdrew their $1.2 million funding commitment. The investors received my email, reviewed the recorded title, and instantly terminated all communication with Julian. Julian's grand, visionary commercial development venture collapsed before a single shovel ever touched the dirt. The anger flared briefly when Harrison realized the notice of default was not a theatrical prop. Clara mailed a formal, certified legal warning to the Scottsdale address detailing the acceleration clause and the exact, unchangeable date the property would proceed to a public county foreclosure auction. Harrison signed for the certified letter. The heavy legal jargon and the stark reality of the Maricopa County timeline completely crushed his remaining patriarchal bravado. He could no longer rely on his aggressive authority to intimidate me. The administrative blackout I had initiated had successfully isolated them, exposing their complete logistical incompetence. Vanessa's social media campaign had spectacularly backfired, leaving them socially stranded and alienated from the extended family. Julian was entirely useless, stripped of his fake funding and exposed as a fraud to his wealthy friends. Harrison was completely cornered. To stop the foreclosure process and avoid the profound, unimaginable public humiliation of being physically evicted by the county sheriff, he had to settle the outstanding debt. He desperately needed $420,000 in liquid cash. Because Harrison's entire life was a facade built on maxed-out credit, he did not possess those funds. He didn't even have a fraction of it. He had to execute the only financial maneuver left on the board. He had to liquidate the primary asset. Harrison hired a premium Scottsdale real estate agent. He likely framed the sudden decision to Margaret as a strategic downsizing. He would tell her they were going to sell the sprawling estate, pay off my primary lien to get me out of their lives, and use the substantial remaining equity to buy a smaller, respectable luxury condo. He assumed he could settle the debt, maintain a comfortable, wealthy lifestyle, and quietly sweep the entire catastrophic failure under a designer rug. Harrison's assumption was based on a fundamental, fatal miscalculation of his own golden son's character. The real estate agent did exactly what any competent professional does before listing a high-value property on the open market. The agent requested a preliminary title report from a local escrow company to verify clear ownership and identify any outstanding encumbrances that needed to be cleared at closing. When that title report was generated, it revealed a devastating structural reality that Harrison had never, in his wildest nightmares, anticipated. As a senior commercial title examiner, I already knew exactly what that report contained. I didn't need to run a new search. I had been quietly monitoring the chain of title for the Scottsdale property since the day I bought the debt 3 years ago. I tracked every single document recorded against that specific parcel number. 2 years ago, a massive anomaly had appeared on my screen. It was a recorded document buried deep in the county archives. It was a contractor's mechanic's lien. In the state of Arizona, a contractor's lien is a legal claim against a property filed by a contractor or a materials supplier who has not been paid for labor that supposedly improved that specific piece of real estate. It heavily clouds the title, entirely preventing the owner from selling or refinancing the property until the debt is fully settled. The lien recorded against Harrison's house was substantial. It demanded exactly $115,000 for extensive luxury renovations, including structural framing, high-end masonry, and custom desert landscaping. The framing and masonry work was entirely fictitious. The renovations never happened. The physical entity that filed the lien was a newly formed shell corporation registered to a cheap P.O. box. A brief 10-minute forensic dive into the state corporate filings revealed the registered agent for that shell company. It was Julian. When Julian's original flipping business collapsed 3 years ago, he was left with massive personal debt and absolutely zero income. My $420,000 bailout saved Harrison from a bank foreclosure, but it did not provide Julian with any fresh operating capital. My brother desperately needed money to maintain his lavish lifestyle, pay his condo fees, and keep leasing his Porsche. He needed a mechanism to secretly extract equity from the family home without alerting the primary creditor. So Julian created a fake contracting company. He drew up highly detailed, completely fraudulent invoices detailing fictitious renovations performed on the Scottsdale property. Then, he forged Harrison's signature on a contract acknowledging the fake debt. Using those forged documents, Julian filed the $115,000 contractor's lien against his own parents' house. He then took that secured debt instrument and sold it to a ruthless third-party debt buyer named Derek at a steep discount. Julian walked away with a massive lump sum of unregulated cash, which he used to fund his fake lifestyle for the next 2 years. Derek, the debt buyer, now held a legally recorded, high-interest lien against the property. Because Harrison never checked public records, and Margaret never questioned how Julian afforded his lifestyle, the fraudulent lien sat there silently, compounding predatory interest penalties for 2 entire years. I found the anomaly the week it was recorded. I saw the forged signature. I traced the entire fraudulent architecture. I didn't call Harrison. I didn't confront Julian. I didn't attempt to fix the problem. I let the lien sit there like a loaded spring trap buried beneath the floorboards. I allowed Julian to dig his own grave, knowing the secondary lien was fraudulent, but legally binding until challenged in a massive, expensive court battle. I knew the compound interest was actively eating away at whatever equity remained in the property. When the real estate agent handed Harrison the preliminary title report, the spring trap finally snapped shut, breaking the patriarch's legs. The arithmetic of the Scottsdale house was now exposed with brutal, undeniable clarity. The current market value of the property in a rush sale was approximately $650,000. My primary notice of default demanded $420,000. The fraudulent contractor's lien, with 2 years of compounded interest, demanded over $140,000. Factoring in realtor commissions, closing costs, and taxes, the total debt wildly exceeded the value of the asset. The house was completely underwater. There was zero equity left to cash out. Julian's secret, devastating theft, meant that selling the house would not provide a comfortable downsizing safety net. Selling the house would leave Harrison and Margaret completely, utterly bankrupt. The golden boy, the visionary entrepreneur, the son Harrison proudly toasted at the anniversary dinner, was finally revealed as a parasitic, thieving fraud. Julian had not just failed in business. He had actively and systematically stolen his parents' entire future to fund his leased sports cars and his fake lifestyle. On day 18 of the countdown clock, my phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed Harrison's number. I didn't let it go to voicemail. I swiped the screen and accepted the call. Victor. My father's voice was completely unrecognizable. The booming, resonant tone that commanded dining rooms and intimidated local politicians was entirely gone. He sounded hollow, frail, and deeply, profoundly exhausted. He was actively crying. I said absolutely nothing. I sat at my desk and listened to the ragged, wet sound of his breathing over the cellular connection. I saw the title report, he sobbed, the words catching violently in his throat. The realtor showed me the lien. Julian forged my name. He forged my signature on a construction contract. The debt buyer says we owe $140,000. The house is completely underwater. If we sell, we walk away with absolutely nothing. We will be bankrupt. We will lose everything. He paused, struggling to pull in a deep, shaky breath. He was experiencing the crushing, suffocating weight of a total narrative collapse. His pristine image, his patriarchal dominance, his blind faith in his golden son. It was all gone, reduced to a pile of fraudulent paperwork and unpaid bills. Please, Victor, he begged, his voice dropping to a desperate, pathetic whisper. You have to pull the default. You have to give us more time. We can figure this out. I can talk to the debt buyer. We can fight the forgery in court. Please do not take the house. You are the only one who can save us. I sat at my kitchen table, the exact same table where I had dismantled their invisible infrastructure weeks prior. I listened to his tears. If this exact conversation had occurred 3 years ago, I would have mobilized instantly. I would have deployed my industry expertise to challenge the fraudulent lien. I would have hired lawyers to negotiate a settlement with the debt buyer. I would have absorbed his panic, internalized his stress, and turned it into a meticulously organized spreadsheet. I would have saved them again. But I was no longer the invisible engine running their operations. I was the primary creditor executing a legal contract. While I listened to my father cry, I didn't picture the house I grew up in. I didn't picture the framed family photographs lining the hallway. I pictured the massive granite island in the kitchen. I pictured the cheap, yellow plastic plate bending under the weight of the dry chicken. I pictured the red marker spelling team player. I pictured Vanessa placing her designer bag on the only empty chair while my father turned his back, refusing to acknowledge my physical exhaustion. They didn't want me as a son. They wanted me as a shock absorber. And shock absorbers do not grant legal extensions. I cannot do that, Dad, I replied. My voice was calm, incredibly steady, and entirely devoid of malice. The 30-day deadline is fixed. The notice of default stands. You have 12 days left to clear the balance, or the property transfers to my holding company. I ended the call. The reality of the situation was now locked into an inevitable, crushing trajectory. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Day 30 of the countdown clock arrived on a Tuesday. The Arizona heat was still oppressive, relentless in its intensity, baking the pavement of the wealthy neighborhood. At exactly 2 p.m., I parked my car in the driveway of the Scottsdale residence. I didn't park on the street like an obscure, unwanted guest. I parked directly in the center of the stamped concrete, occupying the space traditionally reserved for the patriarch's luxury sedan. I turned off the engine and looked at the front of the house. The manicured desert landscaping looked pristine. The stucco walls were freshly painted. The physical structure projected a massive illusion of immense wealth and unshakable stability. It was a beautiful, meticulously maintained lie. I stepped out of the vehicle. I wasn't wearing a silk tie or a suit bought to appease a country club dress code. I was wearing a dark gray tailored power suit. The fabric was structured, sharp, and entirely uncompromising. In my right hand, I carried a thick, black leather binder containing over 200 pages of documented financial history. I walked up the path toward the heavy mahogany front door. I didn't ring the bell. I grabbed the brass handle, turned the latch, and walked inside. The air conditioning hummed, creating a deceptive atmosphere of cool calm. I bypassed the foyer and walked directly into the formal dining room. The setting was drastically different from the anniversary dinner 30 days prior. The rented crystal and imported orchids were completely gone. The room felt hollow, stripped of its festive armor. 5 people were seated around the massive mahogany table. Harrison sat near the center, his posture severely slumped, his face pale, unshaven, and deeply drawn. He looked 10 years older, his immaculate image completely shattered by the sheer weight of impending bankruptcy. Margaret sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The confident society matron had vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified, shaking woman clinging to the wreckage of her shattered reality. Julian and Vanessa sat across from them. Julian was missing his usual aggressive, podcast bro smirk. He stared blankly at his hands, his designer shirt wrinkled at the cuffs. Vanessa sat rigidly with a defensive posture, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was notably not carrying her $3,000 Chanel bag. At the far end of the table sat an unfamiliar man in a conservative suit and wire-rimmed glasses. A legal pad and a silver pen rested on the wood in front of him. He was the real estate attorney Harrison had hired in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to negotiate a settlement and stop the foreclosure. I walked past the empty chairs. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the absolute head of the table, the exact seat Harrison had occupied during his grand toast, the exact table I was forbidden to attend. I pulled back the heavy gold-cushioned chair and sat down. Clara, my attorney, stood silently behind me, projecting lethal competence. The silence in the room was absolute. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Miller, the attorney began, his voice smooth and practiced, carrying the tone of a professional accustomed to de-escalating hostile disputes. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us today. We understand the notice of default expires at midnight. We are here to discuss a structured restructuring plan. My clients are prepared to offer a modified payment schedule to settle the primary debt, while we address the secondary lien currently clouding the title. I didn't look at the attorney. I placed the thick black binder on the polished mahogany surface, unclasped the leather strap, and flipped open the cover. I am not here to negotiate a restructuring plan, I stated. My voice was even carrying the precise, detached authority of a forensic auditor delivering a fatal diagnosis. I am here to deliver the final accounting. I flipped to the first tab in the binder. For 3 years, I operated as the invisible infrastructure of this family. I began, directing my gaze strictly toward Harrison and Margaret. You assumed the $420,000 bailout was my only investment. You were completely wrong. I looked down at the spreadsheet printed on the top page. I began reading the numbers aloud. The data was irrefutable. Property tax escrows fronted to prevent municipal delinquency, $14,000. Auto insurance premiums paid to maintain coverage after multiple at-fault accidents, $3,200. Country club dues subsidized to preserve social standing, $21,600. HOA dues covered to prevent secondary liens on Julian's condo, $19,800. I turned the page. The crisp sound of heavy paper echoed in the quiet room. Emergency catering secured out-of-pocket 3 hours before the anniversary dinner, $340. Vintage wine and floral centerpieces purchased to facilitate a fraudulent toast, $2,000. I looked up from the binder. Total auxiliary capital deployed outside the primary mortgage contract, $60,940. That is the exact price of the labor you extracted while simultaneously erasing my presence from this household. Margaret closed her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Harrison stared at the table, entirely unable to hold my gaze. I flipped to the next tab in the binder. I extracted a thick, stapled document bearing the official stamp of the Maricopa County Recorder's Office. I slid it across the mahogany table toward Harrison. That is the certified copy of the contractor's lien currently clouding your title, I said. 2 years ago, Julian established a fictitious shell corporation. He generated fraudulent invoices for non-existent structural renovations. He forged your signature on the debt acknowledgement and filed that lien against this property. He sold that forged instrument to a third-party debt buyer named Derek, extracting over $100,000 in unregulated cash. The lawyer leaned forward, quickly pulling the document toward him. He scanned the pages, his professional composure immediately faltering as he recognized the clear, undeniable evidence of forgery and fraud. Julian shifted in his chair, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "That is a lie," he muttered, his voice incredibly weak, completely devoid of any real conviction. "You can't prove that." I turned to the next page in the binder. I pulled out a printed copy of the uniform commercial loan application Julian had emailed me weeks prior, the document containing his and Harrison's signatures, swearing under penalty of perjury that the house was free and clear of any encumbrances. I slid the loan application across the table, placing it precisely next to the forged contractor's lien. "You emailed me the proof, Julian," I replied. "You signed a federal document claiming a clean title while simultaneously holding a forged secondary lien and entirely ignoring my recorded primary debt. You handed me the exact physical evidence required to execute a bulletproof, unassailable foreclosure." Julian stared at the application with his mouth slightly open, the staggering reality of his own catastrophic arrogance finally crashing down on him. He was completely trapped, boxed in by his own fraudulent paperwork. Vanessa pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You forged a lien against your own parents' house?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "You told me the flipping business was generating legitimate revenue. You told me the venture capital was real." Julian didn't answer her. He kept his eyes locked on the table. The grand illusion of the golden boy was completely dismantled, reduced to its pathetic, fraudulent core. I directed my attention back to Margaret. "When you handed me a yellow plastic plate and ordered me to eat in the kitchen, you used a specific phrase," I said, my tone dropping into a cold, dangerous stillness. "You told me to be a team player. You said, you know your place. You assumed I would blindly absorb the indignity to protect the family facade." I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward slightly to ensure my words carried the absolute weight of their consequence. "You misunderstood the entire architecture of my presence in this house," I continued. "I did not initiate this foreclosure over petty revenge. I did not call the note due because you excluded me from a dinner party. I called the note due to protect my asset from a syndicate of predatory private equity lenders." I looked directly into Harrison's eyes, forcing him to confront the devastating truth. If I had allowed Julian to secure that $1.2 million commercial loan, the lenders would have discovered the forged contractor's lien. They would have discovered my primary debt. Julian would have defaulted immediately. Those corporate sharks would have seized this property, evicted you in 90 days, and wiped out my entire life savings in the liquidation process. You were actively conspiring to bankrupt me to fund an illusion. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, quietly closing his legal pad. He recognized an absolute checkmate when he saw one. There was no negotiation to be had. The legal and moral high ground was entirely occupied. I foreclosed to save my own financial life, I stated, closing the thick black binder. The 30-day clock expires at midnight. The acceleration clause is fully triggered. The title transfers to my holding company tomorrow morning. I stood up from the head of the table, picking up the leather binder. I looked at the 5 people sitting in the absolute ruins of their manicured Scottsdale illusion. The patriarch who traded his integrity for appearances. The mother who valued a country club membership over her son's dignity. The brother who stole their future. The wife who realized her meal ticket was entirely fake. I tapped my knuckles twice against the polished mahogany wood. The sound was sharp, final, definitive. You know your place, I said. I turned my back on the dining room and walked toward the foyer. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for apologies or frantic pleas for mercy. The audit was complete. The ledger was balanced. The massive debt was finally settled. I walked out the heavy front door and stepped into the hot Arizona afternoon. The heat felt clean, felt like a massive purge. The long, suffocating chapter of invisible labor was officially over. The fallout was incredibly swift. When you sever a parasitic relationship, the machinery of justice moves with quiet, unyielding precision. The very next morning, Clara filed the final paperwork with the county clerk. The title to the Scottsdale property officially transferred to my holding company. 3 days later, a white SUV bearing the gold star of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department parked against the curb. Officer Miller, a stern man with zero patience for suburban drama, stepped into the morning heat and served the formal eviction notice. Harrison and Margaret did not hire a premium packing service. They could no longer afford it. Sweating in the unforgiving sun, they were forced to load their belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and relocate to a small, generic 2-bedroom apartment situated near a remarkably noisy commercial highway. Their entire identity was tied to a zip code they no longer possessed. It was the absolute funeral of their social standing. Julian experienced a completely different category of ruin. Derek, the third-party debt buyer who held the forged contractor's lien, initiated a massive civil lawsuit against him for systemic fraud. Process servers began showing up at his luxury condo. Because he entirely lacked the income to maintain his lifestyle, his pristine German Porsche was aggressively repossessed by the dealership. A tow truck hooked the vehicle in the middle of the night, dragging it away while his neighbors watched. As the illusion of wealth completely evaporated, Vanessa executed her own ruthless exit strategy. She had married a narrative of boundless success. She had absolutely zero interest in funding a criminal legal defense or navigating a sudden plunge into poverty. Vanessa packed her extensive collection of designer shoes and vintage clothing, shouldered her $3,000 black quilted lambskin bag, and ordered a ride-share vehicle. She filed for divorce within the week, citing irreconcilable differences, leaving Julian completely alone to face his mounting legal summons and potential jail time. The golden boy was entirely stripped of his armor, left standing in an empty condo with a ruined credit score and 0 lifelines remaining. 2 weeks after the eviction was officially finalized, I drove back to the Scottsdale property. I parked my car in the driveway. The moving trucks were gone. The sheriff's vehicle was gone. The neighborhood was quiet, restored to its usual insulated peace. I walked up to the front entrance and unlocked the mahogany door using the brand new key provided by the locksmith. I crossed the threshold. The central air conditioning was off. The interior felt warm, stuffy, and profoundly silent. I walked through the grand foyer and stepped into the main living spaces. The visceral sensation of walking through a foreclosed structure is incredibly difficult to articulate. The physical architecture remains perfectly intact, but the soul of the space is entirely erased. My shoes clicked loudly against the hardwood floors, echoing off the bare, empty walls. Faded rectangular outlines marred the premium paint, revealing exactly where the framed family portraits used to hang. The pictures of Harrison shaking hands and Julian scoring soccer goals were completely gone, leaving only dust and empty drywall. I walked into the kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed in the afternoon light. I stood directly in front of the large granite island. I looked at the exact geometric center of the stone. There was no yellow plastic plate. There was no manila envelope demanding accountability. There was only clean, polished rock. I turned and walked into the formal dining room. The space felt massive and cavernous. The majestic table was gone. The gold-cushioned chairs were gone. The rented crystal chandelier had long since been returned to the vendor. I stood in the exact spot where I was banished. I looked at the corner where Vanessa had placed her purse to deliberately prevent me from sitting. The room was reduced to the absolute bare essentials. Just floors, walls, and windows. I stood in the silence and ran a deep, internal emotional diagnostic. I checked for a trace of sadness. I checked for a lingering fragment of guilt. Society heavily conditions us to feel profound remorse when we finally set a boundary with toxic family members. We are taught that preserving the family unit is our inherent, unbreakable responsibility, regardless of the massive toll it takes on our own physical and financial survival. We are expected to absorb the impact, set the table, and smile through the disrespect. I felt absolutely zero guilt. I didn't feel fiercely triumphant either. Triumph implies a game played for fun. This was not a game. It was a forensic audit of a deeply toxic dynamic. I felt clean. I felt incredibly light. I felt like a ledger that had finally been balanced after years of carrying a heavy, exhausting mathematical error. The deficit was corrected. The massive accounts were settled. The property belonged to me, completely free of all emotional manipulation and financial parasitism. I had excised the infection and successfully reclaimed my asset. I walked back to the front door. I stepped outside and locked the heavy deadbolt, securing my investment. I walked down the stamped concrete driveway, got into my car, and started the engine. I drove away from the neighborhood without checking the rearview mirror even once. Shortly after the title officially transferred to my holding company, I listed the property on the commercial real estate market. A massive corporate investor purchased the lot within 2 weeks with the explicit intention of bulldozing the existing structure and building a modern, multifamily architectural compound. The extremely lucrative sale liquidated the principal balance of my original $420,000 loan and provided a massive return on my investment. I recovered my initial capital, paid the associated capital gains taxes, and permanently closed the ledger on that specific parcel of dirt forever. I didn't keep the physical house because I have absolutely zero desire to curate a massive, expensive museum of bad memories. The transaction is completely concluded. What is life like when you finally stop paying rent at someone else's table? I live in a completely different space now. The Arizona sun still sets over the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. But the light filtering into my dining room hits a profoundly different kind of surface. 2 months after the county sheriff finalized the eviction, I commissioned a local artisan carpenter to build a custom dining table for my new residence. I chose solid American walnut. I didn't want a cheap wood veneer. I didn't want a composite material explicitly designed to project an illusion of wealth while remaining entirely hollow on the inside. I required deep, unbreakable structural integrity. When the delivery crew brought the finished piece into my home, it took 4 grown men to support the massive weight of the wood. The table spans 10 feet in length. The wood grain is dark, incredibly rich, and unapologetically permanent. It does not bend under the weight of a shared meal. It does not wobble when you lean your elbows heavily against the edge. It is the exact, undeniable physical antithesis of a cheap yellow plastic plate. Last Saturday night, I hosted a dinner party. I didn't hire an overpriced catering staff to manage the kitchen logistics. I didn't buy extravagant floral arrangements to artificially impress local politicians or fake venture capitalists. I invited 8 people. 2 colleagues from the title agency who share my deep appreciation for precise documentation. Clara, the brilliant lawyer who helped me execute the foreclosure. A veteran mentor who guided me through the early, difficult stages of my career. And a handful of close, authentic friends who actually know the sound of my genuine laugh. We prepared the food together, moving freely and happily around the kitchen. We opened standard bottles of red wine, pouring equal measures into everyday glasses. Nobody occupied a seat based on their perceived social capital. Nobody placed a designer bag on a velvet cushion to aggressively claim territory and assert dominance. Most importantly, absolutely nobody asked me to leave the room to manage logistics while they enjoyed the rewards of my invisible labor. I sat at the absolute head of my own table. I remained seated throughout the entire course of the meal. I was an active, respected participant in my own life, instead of the unseen engine running the background machinery for someone else. I rested my hands flat against the polished, cool surface of the walnut wood and felt a deep, resonant sense of true belonging. I occasionally receive minor updates about my relatives through peripheral channels. The information trickles down via mutual acquaintances who still monitor the digital footprint left by my ex-sister-in-law. Harrison and Margaret remain trapped in their generic 2-bedroom apartment near the noisy commercial highway. They do not host lavish anniversary dinners. They do not mingle at the country club tennis pavilion. Their entire social circle evaporated the exact moment their address changed and their credit lines expired. Julian is currently navigating an absolute maze of civil litigation, desperately defending himself against the debt buyers he actively defrauded. He is learning the incredibly hard way that reciting podcast quotes about relentless entrepreneurship does not hold up well during sworn legal depositions. Without the massive shield of my financial infrastructure, his bad decisions carry immediate, devastating consequences. We do not speak. There are no holiday text messages. There are no awkward phone calls attempting to bridge the massive distance on birthdays. The silence that began during the administrative blackout has calcified into a permanent, unbreakable structural boundary. Some people might view this outcome as a massive tragedy. Society heavily conditions us to believe that cutting ties with your family is an unnatural, unforgivable act. We are taught to absorb infinite transgressions in the name of shared genetics. We are instructed to preserve the family unit regardless of the physical, emotional, and financial price it violently extracts from us. This toxic social conditioning relies entirely on the existence of the spare chair. Every dysfunctional family requires a spare chair. It is the designated role for the highly competent, highly responsible child who desperately seeks validation through sheer utility. We wrongly assume that if we fix enough problems, balance enough checkbooks, and save enough properties, we will eventually earn a permanent, respected seat at the main table. We confuse being essential with being genuinely valued. But competence does not breed love in a parasitic system. Competence breeds deep exploitation. When you function as the massive shock absorber for people who completely refuse to control their own speed, they do not thank you for smoothing out the ride. They simply drive faster, fully expecting you to absorb the increasing impact without a single complaint. The minute you ask them to slow down, they violently accuse you of ruining the trip. The moment you finally step out of the vehicle, they crash. They will always blame you for the wreckage because taking true responsibility requires a level of deep self-reflection they are fundamentally incapable of achieving. I spent 15 years operating under the massive delusion that my invisible labor was a down payment on future respect. I learned the hard way that respect is not a commodity you can purchase through administrative compliance. If someone requires you to continuously subsidize their existence before they will even acknowledge your basic humanity, you are not building a relationship. You are funding a hostage situation. The transition from the spare chair in the kitchen to the head of your own table is a quiet, sometimes brutal process. It requires you to completely stop auditing their toxic behavior and start rigorously auditing your own boundaries. Boundaries are not cruel punishments. They are not weapons designed to inflict pain or exact petty revenge. Boundaries are simply the tax you charge people who try to live in your life for free. If the tax is too high for them to pay, they will naturally evict themselves from your premises. You do not have to chase them down the driveway screaming their name. You just have to change the locks and let the brutal math work itself out. My family completely refused to pay the tax. They preferred the empty illusion of wealth over the reality of their own son. They chose the visual aesthetic of a catered dining room over the integrity of a transparent ledger. They made their choice when they handed me a flimsy piece of yellow plastic and told me to hide on the patio. I made my choice when I walked out the front door holding the paperwork that legally owned the patio. I harbor no lingering resentments. Resentment is a heavy, incredibly uncomfortable currency, and I prefer to keep my accounts perfectly clean. I look at the solid American walnut surface in my dining room, and I feel a profound, unshakable sense of equilibrium. I earned every single inch of this wood. I own the floorboards beneath it. I hold the completely unencumbered deed to my own peace of mind. When you finally stop operating as the unpaid infrastructure for people who constantly take you for granted, you discover exactly how much energy you actually possess. You discover the unmistakable joy of preparing a meal for genuine guests who actually ask about your day, instead of demanding your credit card number. You discover that true loyalty should always be a reciprocal investment, not a massive one-way drain on your personal resources. Love without respect is just unpaid labor, and I am officially, permanently retired from working for free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I hope that sharing my journey helps someone out there who is constantly being handed the plastic plate in their own family dynamics. Remember, you do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep other people warm. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a massive boundary with people you love? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves.